Hey everybody. As you know, I'm having a little bit of a problem with my computer that I normally do videos on, and so as such, I can only, I can only do these unedited, uh, poorly produced webcam videos. But there is one video I wanted to go ahead and get in on, or topic I wanted to go ahead and weigh in on in the meantime, and I can do it by just sitting here. Laci Green has recently had something of a change of heart and expressed willingness to listen to people on the other side of the social justice discussion. I think this is a good thing, and some people have questioned her motives. I have no reason to question her motives. She seems sincere to me, but I think regardless of that, anytime somebody from the other side is willing to listen to what we have to say, especially somebody as prominent and well-known as Laci Green, I think that should absolutely be discussed and be entertained. If somebody has a direct line to Laci Green that could make sure she sees this, that would be great. Laci, I know you want to do debates with various people on the other side of the discussion. I prefer it just be a conversation rather than a debate, because a debate implies, competition, and you focus more on the winning than on having a good discussion. But anyway, the point being, Laci had asked one specific question a while ago that I wanted to respond to, and that was, if you're someone who thinks that there's only two gender identities, or there's only two genders, why do you feel that way? Okay, so we need to unpack this a little bit. One of the reasons I do not believe that anyone is being oppressed because I assumed that they were male or female. The thing is, what's happened is we live in a world where postmodernism has infected the civil rights discussion and that sort of thing, and so when the college protesters started reading Foucault and that kind of thing, I think we started a very negative downhill spiral where we start thinking of every absolute as somehow oppressive. And the postmodernists like to say that there are no absolutes. Well, guess what? There are absolutes. And I can prove it too. If you say there are no absolutes, you're making an absolute statement. Therefore, absolutes exist. So, with that out of the way, why are male and female an absolute? Why are there not more genders? Okay, well, first of all, and I can only speak for myself, but we have to unpack what's being said there a little bit. Now, I understand that people on we'll say the social justice side of this discussion will tell you that there's a difference between sexual classification and gender identity. That sexual classification refers to your genitalia and your chromosomes, versus gender identity refers to how you feel about, or how you identify, how you personally identify. There are facets of your existence that are that morally should be identified as being yours. Your name, you should be referred to by the name you want to be referred to as, however weird or ridiculous it might be. Now, you have to stop and think about your name, though. Why is that your name? Well, that can be your name under two circumstances. One, it's your name because you're on a desert island and there's nobody else around, and so the only person you have to account to is yourself. You are whatever you say your name is. Two, you live in a society that is willing to recognize you by that name. And most free societies, well, actually I would say all free societies because it's a component of freedom, all free societies are willing to give you the grant you the courtesy of referring to you by the name you wish to be referred to as. Why is that? Well, it's because identity is a two-way street. Identity is not something that you possess fully separated or irrespective of the outside world, hence my desert island example. if you are wishing to be identified as something, then you have to communicate to the cognition of others that this is your identity. So so let's establish the basis of identity. The basis of identity is, sorry, I'm just keeping Samantha quiet. Anyway, the basis of identity is that is what Aristotle laid out. A is A. A thing is itself. It cannot be, a rock cannot be a rock and a feather at the same time. It cannot be all red and all green at the same time. A is A. So, we have to think about the difference between identity and non-identity. Most people will acknowledge your identity. The problem is that what so many of these multiple gender people, more than two gender people, want is actually an acknowledgement of non-identity. And it does not work like that. We have to have an observable, objective identity concept to identify people by. Now, I want to explain something. Now, first of all, understand, I feel if you are someone who sees yourself as agendered or genderless or what have you, whatever, I may not agree with that, but I certainly do not in any way, shape, or form wish you any kind of ill or any harm or anything like that. And if I seem irritable and sarcastic about the various college hipsters that seem to be doing this more out of a sense of pretentiousness than anything else, that certainly should not suggest that I am trying to punch down towards people who are legitimately in conflict about this or legitimately see themselves as outside the spectrum. That said, I don't see you as being outside the spectrum, and I'll explain why. Now, to understand why I feel this way, you have to understand something. I do believe that trans men are real men and trans women are real women. Granted, we can identify them as trans women and trans men or as trans in general, but that is in service of a specific gender. Okay, I think Samantha's quiet enough now I can put her down. So, if I say, if you were to say that a person starting out as a man is transitioning to a woman or vice versa, we have an observable endpoint for what that transition is. If you're transitioning to be nothing, then you're not transitioning. So this is what Ayn Rand would refer to as the worship of the zero. Life is not the absence of death. Pleasure is not the absence of pain. Your existence, base existence does not give you, is not enjoyment of life, basically. So, by extension, the absence of, when you say you are not male or female, the absence of saying that you are absent male or female in your identity is not an identity. We have had terminology to describe people who who fall between the socially standard gender normative behaviors or expressions, and that term is androgynous. When I hear about things like other, non-binary, gender non-binary, gender non-conforming, genderqueer, gender fluid, two-spirit, all of these other terms, all you're really saying is, I'm neither one of these things. Okay. Then what are you? And that's the question. I have never heard a third gender be identified. All I have heard, I have pored over the lists of these lists, like the whatever 50 some odd gender identifications that Facebook now lists, and what you've got, what I see is male, female, trans, which just means you're moving between male or female, so there's still only two possible endpoints. And then a whole bunch of terms that just mean miscellaneous. And the absence, that miscellaneous is not an identity. That just saying gender non-conforming, that's not an identity. Because you have to be identified as something. So, this gets back to identity being a two-way street. Your identity is who you are, to how you identify yourself to yourself, then it's how other people identify you in their own minds. And so if a person, if the human computer runs the data banks and says, well, it doesn't fit into any of these logical boxes, and I'm saying it to refer to something that is not identified as either of these things, I'm not trying to objectify. It does not fall into either of these understood presentations, understood concepts of gender. Okay, then it goes into the category of nothing, please specify. And nothing is ever specified. You cannot identify yourself. That's the worship of the zero that Ayn Rand was talking about. You cannot identify yourself as not being something. I am not a lamp. That does not identify me as any kind of gender or race or nationality or religion or any other perspective. I am not a Ibanez Artcore hollow body. That does not identify me as being anything. The absence of something, necessitates the presence of something else in terms of identity. And so no gender is not a third gender. That it's just the absence of one of the two genders. Now, we have situations, the standard male and female understanding is male is XY chromosomes and a dick. Woman is XX chromosomes and a vag. Okay. So, that established, there are exceptions. There are intersexed individuals, which are people who have one set of chromosomes and a different set of genitalia. Okay, so there is a split between two facets of your biological gender. Now, what are you? Are you going to be male or female? Or are you going to be somewhere in between? But what you have there is just a divergence between two primary qualities on a checklist that determine gender. You have a divergence, I don't want to say a mismatch, that sounds insensitive, but you have a divergence between these two things. That's still not the presence of another gender. If I say, if I say there are only two colors, red and blue, you can say, no, there's green, there's yellow, there's brown, there's, black, white, all of this. But what you can't say is, oh, I've got a color, it's not red or blue. Because that necessitates the question, well, what is it? You have other cases where people might be genderless. You could debate about whether or not women who have had hysterectomies or men who have had their testicles amputated constitute a genderless person. There are certainly genderless people to the extent that you have cases like conjoined twins that have only one set of sex organs between them and they're separated, and one of the separated twins does not have sex organs. They still have chromosomes, but at that point, that person becomes essentially in an external sense, they become essentially genderless. So, nevertheless, you're still talking about the absence of one of two things. And the absence of one of these two things is not in and of itself an identity. So, to be perfectly blunt about it, you have the men who have the testicles and penis that are responsible for insemination. You have the women who have the vagina, the ovaries, the uterus, all of that, which is responsible for gestation of the and carrying the child to term, and, or the fetus to term, and all of that. That is what we are. That is why we identify these two separate things. That's the purpose that society at large, and when I say society, I mean other people outside of you, that's the purpose that people have for identifying these two things. So for you to come along and say, I don't identify as either of these two things, society says, well, then what are you? And you say, well, it's my new buzzword for not otherwise specified. I think that's logically going to grate on people's nerves, because what it sounds like at that point to a lot of people is that you're just trying to be nonconformist for the sake of like you're just not that you're being nonconformist, because nonconformity I think is good on the whole. It's that you are rebelling where there's nothing to rebel against. Is how I think a lot of people feel. And this is getting a little editorial here, but I hear most of this talk about a third gender comes from, I see it coming from either college kids or their professors. And college kids are at an age where they are stepping out from home, from mom and dad for the first time, and they are trying to find a place in the world. And what's happened is we've got this weird notion where we try to create individual identity by way of collectivism. You know, all of the overwhelming bias in our universities is towards a collectivist doctrine, towards ideas of socialism and communism and that kind of thing. And that's an overwhelmingly collectivist doctrine. And so what happens is they try to have their cake and eat it too. They try to say, you can be an individual within the structure, within the conceptual framework of something that in no way, shape, or form acknowledges your individuality. So, if I say, so at that point, you know, they want to say, well, you can become an individual by creating a series of demographics for, you know, compounded demographics for yourself until you get to a point where you are a collective group of one, so to speak. I think that's almost the unstated goal that they have. So when you become what people call a hyphen American. You know, I'm not just an American, I'm an African American, I'm a gay African American, I'm a gay transgendered African American. These are all legitimate identities, but even legitimate ways to identify, obviously, but it still doesn't cross the threshold into individual identity. So then we start saying, well, what else can we pull out? You know, which other dividers can we put in to separate us from the herd, from the collective? And so we start trying to strip away things that are absolutes to try to create something else. And when we say create something else, that brings us back to the inevitable question of, well, what is it? And you can't identify something by saying it's not that. I'm neither Democrat or Republican. I'm a libertarian. And you could say that about, you know, and there's so many different political parties. You could say Socialist, Green Party, Reform Party, Libertarian Party, all of these different political persuasions you can accurately identify. When it comes to gender identity, there's not anything outside of male or female. So I see all of this demographic mongering, to kind of coin an expression, I see all of this demographic mongering as an attempt to create some sense of individual identity within a collectivist doctrine. Meanwhile, if you take on a legitimately individualist stance, you realize that it is not your defaults that define you, or should define you. And the greatest civil rights leaders of our time understood that. That's why Martin Luther King said people should be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. And the same thing is true all across the board. You should be judged by the content of your character, not what you've got in your pants, not what country you come from, not what religion you practice, not what this, that, or the other. To a certain extent, you could say you can be judged by what religion you practice because, you know, if you are a member of the Westboro Baptist Church, for example, or ISIS or whatever, we can't. Not going to unpack that. Extreme Islam. You know, obviously you can be judged by that because that, by definition, includes the association of certain actions and behaviors. But you get my point. Just by default, you should not be judged by your defaults. In fact, I'll go ahead and strike religion from that altogether because religion is not really a default. You happen to be born to parents of a certain religion, but that doesn't mean that you're automatically of that, like you're born into a certain country or a certain race, that kind of thing. Anyway, if you're an individualist, you realize that you are not defined by your defaults. I like to say, you know, it's called your ethnic background because it's behind you. You know, it's not, it's in the background. It's not what you're actually dealing with going forward. So, I truly think that if more kids, more college kids were educated in philosophies that taught them to treat themselves as their own highest value and understand what it means to be your own highest value, they would hopefully start to realize that a lot of this posturing, this kind of creating this imaginary oppression about some non-existent, non-identifiable third gender, that somehow, you know, I think that would fall by the wayside if people were taught to identify themselves by where they are going and what they are doing rather than where they're starting from. And otherwise, because if you think about it, ultimately what you're doing is creating a conformist system, a system that is going to ultimately dominate the individual, take over the individual, and you are trying to find a way within that framework to be an individual. And it's not going to work. It is a contradiction. So, you know, I also want to clarify, you know, I had alluded earlier, I do think that trans men and trans women are legitimately are men or women. But they are men or women. They're not a third thing. There's no third gender that they can become. It's not like you can choose to be men, women, or glebularks. And my God, the glebulark vagina is horrifying. But anyway, so being that that's the case, and I could go into a whole other video of why I think trans persons legitimately are the gender that they are. Suffice to say, I do think that, and I do think that, you know, I will call a trans man a man and a trans woman a woman without hesitation. The thing is, there is the reason that that I grant them the acknowledgement of that identity is because it is a definable endpoint. They're not just saying, you know, it'd be like if a trans woman, for example, said, well, I'm not a man. I would say, okay, so you're a woman. Or what are you? Or if you're not a woman, then what are you? So, it's an identifiable endpoint. And also, biologically, I guess I'm making this video now anyway. Also, biologically, if you think about it, we all start out as female, and male is the abnormality that branches off from that. So, in a way, we all kind of have a blueprint for male and female versions of ourselves inside of us, and the hormonal replacement therapy and all of that is just a way of, you know, activating to whatever extent scientifically possible, activating the male or female version of ourselves. So, you know, you start out as a man, you go on hormones, your voice gets softer, your skin gets softer, you know, your hairline moves back down, all of these things. You start out as a woman, you go on hormones, and you start having facial hair, and your voice drops, and all of that. these are identifiable transitions to specific things. And, you know, we're coming to a point where it's going to be scientifically possible, they say, to switch out your genitalia fully and completely, not just cosmetically, but fully. And so at that point, it really, you know, we really will be talking about people who are fully transitioning from one gender to the other. Anyway, I hope I have made some sense there. I hope I've given some things to talk about, and I know this is a return to my the shorter end of the kind of videos I used to do, where I would just talk for hours and hours. But anyway, I hope that was insightful. I hope Laci Green sees it. I hope other people see it, and I hope maybe they can find some understanding.